How can you change something when you do not fully understand what it is you are changing? Examining the factors that influence the effectiveness of current women's rights law is vital to guiding future policy that further advances the realization of women's rights worldwide. Recent studies suggest that religion can influence the practices of institutions, including governments, and their relationship can negatively influence women's rights. Yet, despite religion's influence on women's rights, it remains understudied. My research examined how the relationship between religion and a state's government may limit the realization of women's rights. I conceptualized the relationship between religion and the state by looking at the level of government involvement in religion, specifically when there are strong ties between religion and the state and the presence of religious legislation. I expected to find that states with strong ties to religion would be less likely to improve the respect for women's rights than states with weak ties to religion, and that states that have implemented religious laws would be less likely to improve respect for women's rights than states without religious laws. I incorporated and analyzed several different measures of women's rights to overcome conceptual and methodological issues in other women's rights studies. Additionally, I wanted to look at how religion affected the effectiveness of women's rights law. Therefore, I chose to look at the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, called CEDAW. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1979 and was drafted to encourage states to combat discrimination against women. Also known as the Women's Bill of Rights, it represented a significant step forward in expanding and protecting the fundamental civil, political, economic, and social rights of women. CEDAW is one of the most broadly endorsed and ratified international human rights treaties, yet the rights laid out in CEDAW have not been fully realized, leading many scholars to debate whether CEDAW has actually been effective in improving the rights of women. The comprehensiveness of the rights and circumstances covered in CEDAW represent a significant step forward for women's human rights to equality and non-discrimination. But it is imperative that a commitment to these rights be reflected in a state's practices and policies. In my study, I expected to find that states who committed to CEDAW but had strong religion-state ties would be slower to improve respect for women's rights than in states with weak religion-state ties who also committed to CEDAW. I also expected that states who committed to CEDAW but had religious laws would be slower to improve respect for women's rights than in states without religious laws who committed. For my study, I had to conceptualize religion and women's rights. It is difficult to study a complex concept like religion in a project with such a large sample because religion can vary drastically between countries and within countries. Therefore, it is important to use a variable that measures religion in a way that is generalizable enough to cover all different religious beliefs and states. I wanted to see how religion affected women's rights at the level of the state because when religion is given political authority within a government and state to control and set societal norms and practices, women's rights are directly impacted. Religion influences laws regarding women's rights and how women experience these rights in practice when it is given the political authority, institutionalized, and is codified into legislation. States utilize religion to determine the rights encompassed and enforced rather than using international treaties such as CEDAW to guide the rights afforded to women. While the dominant religion in a state tends to have a substantial status and influence over government policy, the judicial system, and the incorporation of religious laws into state law, the official and established state religion variable is not a sufficient measurement of the influence religion has on the government due to the wide diversity of states with official and established religions. In some of these states, the official religion is merely a vestige of history, when religion of each country greatly influenced its policy, alliances, and actions. However, in other states, the official religion still influences these aspects of the state. So instead of looking at whether a state has an official state religion, I looked at the relationship between religion and the state. This measurement provided a better idea of how religion influences the state because it focuses on how religion dictates the policy and actions of the state, therefore illustrating whether women's rights fare worse in states with close relationships with religion. To create my measure of strong religion-state ties, I looked at the official relationship between religion and the state, which ranges from separationist, which is the weakest religion-state relationship, to supportive, which is a moderate relationship, to a religious state, which is the strongest religion-state relationship. Since I only wanted to look at strong religion-state ties, I only included states with a state-religion relationship that provided official support to religion. Religion influences women's rights on the institutional level through legislation in states. In some states, there are religious laws, traditions, and biases that are codified into state legislation. The religion legislation variable refers to government laws and policies that legislate and support aspects of religion, including religious precepts, funding religion, and providing official powers and influence to religious institutions. It is difficult to change the realization of women's rights in practice when there are official laws limiting these rights. When certain restrictions on women's rights are codified into legislation, it reaffirms to the general population that these restrictions are right and justified. In order to change the practices, it is imperative that their laws are changed to reflect a commitment to women's rights. Women have no avenue to pursue their rights if they are not even recognized by the state. While some scholars choose to look at the influence of specific religions, I did not do so in my study. Religions have been intermixed with a variety of traditional cultural practices, values, and attitudes that are representative of the area they are practiced within and not of the religion itself. Therefore, studying a specific religion from a global sample could lead to generalizations about certain religions that are inaccurate due to the variety of practices of different areas of the world. Furthermore, several scholars agree that it is not the type of religion that influences women's rights, but the extent to which the religion is connected to the state. Now that I've laid out the complexity of studying a variable like religion, I will lay out the complexity of studying women's rights. Women's rights are challenging to operationalize because the concept has multiple dimensions and multiple ways of measuring each dimension. I looked at women's rights through two categories, law and practice, and looked at the political, economic, and social dimensions. Women may have certain rights laid out in law, but they do not enjoy these rights in practice. For example, a state may have appeared to improve the political rights of women by incorporating the right to vote into the Constitution, but have made no progress on increasing the number of women voting in elections. Given this scenario, it cannot be determined if a woman's right to vote is truly guaranteed. Political rights include the right to vote, run for political office, hold elected and appointed positions, join political parties, and the number of women who are exercising these rights. Economic rights include the financial freedoms of women, their roles in the job market, and the laws protecting equality within the job market. Social rights focus on the securities and freedoms of women within the public and personal sphere and include the right to equal inheritance, to travel abroad, to initiate divorce, receive an education, and participate in community activities. Social rights covers the largest range of indicators, which means that the nuanced understanding is especially important because there's a high possibility that these indicators are affected by different factors. My findings indicated that strong religion-state ties and religious legislation significantly and negatively influenced the realization of women's rights. While both measures affected women's rights, the measure of strong religion-state ties had a larger negative impact than the measure of religious legislation. The analysis provided quantitative data regarding the institutional relationship between religion, the state, and their effect on women's rights. The study results pinpoint the significant impact of religion across the different dimensions of women's rights. Both measures of religion impacted social rights the most, followed by political rights, and then economic rights. In addition to analyzing the effect of religion on women's rights, I wanted to see how the concepts of CEDAW and religion interacted, and if that interaction changed the effectiveness of CEDAW on women's rights. The interaction is important to look at because there are approximately 15 countries that have strong religion-state ties that have also ratified CEDAW. Looking at this interaction would show if a state with a strong religion-state tie caused CEDAW to be implemented less effectively than in states that do not have strong relationships with religion. My results indicated that the impact of CEDAW is limited when there are strong religion-state ties or a large number of religious laws. This means that states with strong religion-state ties that commit to CEDAW experienced less improvement in women's rights than states that committed to CEDAW but did not have strong religion-state ties. and that states with religious laws that committed to CEDAW experienced less improvement in women's rights than states that committed to CEDAW but did not have religious laws. I also wanted to test my measure of religion against another measure of religion commonly used by scholars to compare the results. I decided to use the Muslim percentage of the population since Islam is the religion most discussed as having a negative impact on women's rights, and it was the dominant religion of many of the states that had strong religion-state ties in my study. I found that the Muslim percentage of the population did have a negative impact on women's rights. However, that impact was not as significant or substantial as the impact of strong religion-state ties or religious legislation. This result shows that the different methods of measurement for religion are significant and impact the results of studies. My findings indicate that in order to improve women's rights, it is critical that a state limits the influence of religion on the government and state-level actors, because strong religion-state ties and the number of religious laws significantly and negatively impact the realization of women's rights. Therefore, states that wish to improve the rights of women should work to get rid of strong religion-state ties within their government. While weakening the relationship between religion and the state, states should also work to reform current religious legislation and work to establish more secular-based policy. Instituting these recommendations is not swift or easy, but will result in tangible improvements to women's rights around the world. While the religious beliefs and practices of a society most likely influence women's rights as well, addressing the relationship at the state level could have a trickle-down effect on the society by establishing women's rights as a norm within society and by limiting the allowance of gender discrimination based on religion. It is a more difficult task to change the beliefs of people, but changing how these beliefs are codified into official legislation and supported by the state is more realistic. Furthermore, religion affects different societies uniquely, depending on how the other domestic characteristics interact with it. Uncovering a specific aspect of society that affects women's rights generates hope that women's rights can be improved at a systematic level in countries that many maintain will never see an improvement in women's rights. It is important that a commitment to women's rights is visible through changes in legislation and an increase in the involvement of women in politics, the economy, and the social sphere of society. An understanding of how the different rights are affected by religion and CEDAW can guide policymakers, activists, and organizations working to increase the effectiveness of global women's rights law. Identifying factors that can best promote reform is vital, and these results highlight an important opportunity for state-level reform that could lead to substantial improvement in global women's rights law. Thank you.